All right, we're back. When we last left our intrepid heroes, I feel like, Rocky and Bullwinkle, when they would always go to intermission, then they'd come back and, the voiceover would do the thing, kind of recap everything tied up neatly. That's kind of what I feel like I'm doing. So let's recap and tie up neatly the Marshall Plan. It was technically open to outside countries like the Soviet Union, but clearly established in such a way that they would never respond to it. The Soviet Union isn't going to adopt these, kind of private market mechanisms. It's not going to open up all its books and allow American accountants to come in and look at, how much the Soviet Union, was spending on defense, or, that just was never going to happen. So the Russians thought from the beginning that the Marshall Plan was directed against them, against the communists. The Soviet ambassador in D.C., Gromyko, even said that it revealed the outlines of a Western European bloc directed against us. The Soviets thought correctly that the Marshall Plan was an instrument of America's new hegemony. It was a way to resolve an imminent economic crisis. The Russians, similar to Atchison, understood what the Marshall Plan was about. The Soviet Union's foremost economist, a man named Evgeny Varga, very, very, kind of presciently analyzed it, and he described the Marshall Plan this way. He said, the United States, and this is the Soviets' major economist Varga saying, the United States must grant much greater credits than it had done heretofore just to rid itself of surplus goods at home, even if it knows in advance that part of these credits will never be repaid. In this context, the Marshall Plan's aim was this: if it is necessary for the USA in its own interests to send abroad American goods worth billions of dollars on credit to unreliable debtors, then it is necessary to try to squeeze the maximum political advantages from this. Okay? In a sense, this is a lost leader, right? You're sending the money out. It's gonna bust a hole in the budget. Clearly, you send $17 billion abroad. You're not getting that money back, are you? American companies are getting it back, but that's not making it back in the form of American revenue. All right, you're not giving them this money, and they have to repay it. These aren't loans. All right, so if you're going to do that, then you do it for some political advantage, and the political advantage here is it contains communism, which means that even more of the world will be open and inviting to American capital. As I said before, it really kind of it's really quite brilliant. The Soviet Union did make overtures. They talked to the U.S. about joining the Marshall Plan, but that was never in the cards. In fact, the British and the French governments hoped that the Soviet Union would refuse. So their planning all along was based on the idea that the USSR would not join the Marshall Plan. It wasn't intended for that. Right? The Marshall Plan, especially coming on the heels of the Truman Doctrine, really does consolidate, as I said, American hegemony in the Cold War. This is by 1947, 1948. In all of these major Cold War topics, major Cold War issues, what arises out of this conflict, you can see, a pattern that recurs, time and again, from 1945 onward, whether it be Germany or Iran or the hard line. In all of these cases, the United States has incredible economic power, it has military predominance, and an atomic monopoly. And it's going to use that to get its way. At the same time, on the Soviet side, you see kind of a temperate approach based mainly on the fact that it's just wiped out by World War II. And when there is an actual or acute confrontation, as in Iran, what do you see? You see the Soviets back down. When there's actually an opportunity for them to create mischief, as in Greece, don't really do it. What you see then is clearly in the United States an aggressive power using its strength to get its way. The Soviet Union, badly damaged by World War II, clearly maintaining a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. But the U.S. policy of containment, making sure that that doesn't extend. And in addition to that, you see a Soviet Union aware of its own weaknesses and unable and unwilling as a result of that to act adventurously in wherever. And we'll see more of that, and you'll see that in this period as well. So the crises will continue. What we're going to do is take this all up to around 1950 and talk a little bit about Asia too. Hopefully we'll get to that. But the crises continue. The Soviet Union, by not being either, depending on the way you want to look at it, either not being invited legitimately into the Marshall Plan or rejecting it, really, kind of consolidate the Cold War. The American ambassador to Moscow, Walter Bedell Smith, said that the Soviet Union's refusal to accept the Marshall Plan amounted to nothing less than a declaration of war by the Soviet Union on the immediate issue of control of Europe, which is ironic because people like Varga were making the opposite claim about the U.S., that in fact the announcement, the establishment of the Marshall Plan was actually a declaration of war by the United States on the control of Europe. And again, taking aside ideology, who the good guys are, who's wearing the black hats or the white hats, if you look at it strictly from the balance of power, the U.S. has all the cards, right? It has 50% of the world's trade. Kennan admitted that. It has, incredible alliances. It has money to throw out there in the form of the Marshall Plan or the Truman Doctrine. And so it has, and an atomic monopoly, which, kind of goes without saying. So it has basically, the real cards to play in Europe. And so, if one side has a reason to be kind of cocky and confident, then that would be the U.S. And if another side has a reason to kind of feel besieged and weak, that would be the Soviet Union. That's just the reality of power. That's the balance of power, right? It has nothing to do with good guys or bad guys or anything else like that. In fact, a scholar who used a bunch of Soviet sources said that the Kremlin, Stalin, viewed the Soviet Union, the term that comes up all the time, as vulnerable. So the Soviet Union sees itself as vulnerable. Soviet officials were, this is a guy based on the Soviet documents, Soviet officials were well aware that their country was much weaker in industrial and military capability than the United States. Therefore, based on Soviet records, Stalin's prime concern was consolidating the territory and security gains which the USSR had won in World War II. A policy of confrontation with the West would not serve this goal and might in fact undermine it. You don't want to piss off the Americans. Why? Because they have so much more power than you, which is why whenever there is some point of contention, Stalin backs down. So Stalin's not a nice guy. The Soviet prisons are full of political prisoners. Before World War II, he executed most of his senior staff from the Red Army. He is a terrible man, right? But in terms of outside adventurism, he is not Hitler. He's not even close to Hitler. Stalin, outside of maintaining these occupation forces in Eastern Europe, which one could see within the context of European politics based on the invasions that have occurred, there's no record of outside adventurism. And you see that in Greece, and you see that in Germany, and you'll see it in China, and in Iran, and elsewhere, all right? Nonetheless, Stalin responds harshly to the Marshall Plan. Right? He sees this as an offensive and aggressive measure by the United States to consolidate its control of Europe, which is what Walter Bedell Smith said about the Soviet Union. But as again, look at it through the lens of the balance of power. As a result of that, the Soviet Union rejects the Marshall Plan, of course. But there's a lot of fallout from that. This is a terribly important period and very divisive. First off, once the Soviet Union rejects the Marshall Plan, it creates its own economic program called COMECON, C-O-M-E-C-O-N, which stands for the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. But basically, the Soviet Union creates a Marshall Plan for Eastern Europe, similar to that. As a result of that, though, as a result of this Marshall Plan controversy, two major crises will occur. One in Czechoslovakia and one in Germany. Czechoslovakia quickly. Czechoslovakia, after World War II, even though it was occupied, had actually had an election and elected a non-communist government. The president's name was Eduard Beneš, B-E-N-E-S, and the foreign minister was a guy named Jan Masaryk. Masaryk's father was a well-known Czech nationalist. Czechoslovakia is the only Eastern European country with any real heritage of democracy in the 20th century. So when the war ends, even though the Soviet Union has occupation forces there, the Czechs assert that democracy and elect two non-communists, or elect a non-communist, Beneš, who appoints as his foreign secretary Masaryk, John Masaryk. So the two leading figures in Czech politics are not communist. Stalin's okay with that. From 45 to 47, nothing happens. However, once the Marshall Plan is announced, the Czechs show interest in it. All right. Now, initially, the Soviet Union is somewhat concerned, but they're not going to really do anything about that. However, by February 1948, when the lines are so clearly drawn, Stalin pounces at that point and supports a coup in which both Beneš and Masaryk are overthrown. This was a clear response to the Marshall Plan and Czech interest in the Marshall Plan. Stalin feared losing Czechoslovakia, which he saw as deleterious both from a security and economic standpoint. Now, when the Czech coup takes place, Truman has a field day with that. See, I told you this is what the Russians do. This is what the Soviet Union does. We need more money. We need more Marshall Plan funding. So they kind of play off of each other. That's important. But what happens in Germany is really important. The United States has made it clear time and again, and we know this, that Germany is essential to the economic reconstruction of Europe. And this makes Stalin angry and anxious because, again, he doesn't have the cards to play in Germany like the U.S. does. The U.S. has 3 zones. Stalin has the agricultural zone. The United States is already taking measures to have kind of a common currency system in the 3 Western zones, and it's starting to merge these zones, first into bizonia, then into trizonia. Stalin finally lashes out, all right? Now, okay, these are the zones, right? This is Germany. But in addition to that, in the Eastern Zone is the traditional capital of Berlin. Now, even though Berlin, as you can see, is entirely, exclusively in the Eastern Soviet Zone, what's the disposition of Berlin? How's it set up? It's divided like the rest of Germany. Right? So Berlin is cut in half, east and west. Western Berlin under Western influence, Eastern Berlin under communist influence. Stalin, in 1948, finally says, I've got to do something. In addition to the American role in consolidating the Western zones, currency consolidation, export consolidation, he also takes note of the fact that a lot of the ex-Nazis have come back in, and they're basically running the German economy. So Stalin, feeling desperate, lashes out in Berlin, and in July of 1948, Stalin cuts off all surface traffic to Berlin. There were routes going through all of Eastern Germany where the West could get into Berlin for supplies, for consumer goods, and so there's this huge disparity between West and East Berlin. So Stalin orders that all traffic, all surface traffic between Berlin be stopped, all right? So the United States is facing a crisis. Stalin has cut off. Stalin is threatening the freedom of West Berlin. So the U.S. responds. You're probably familiar with the response. It is a massive airlift. The U.S. Sends 13,000 tons of supplies into West Berlin on a daily basis. Consumer goods, medicine, things like that, food. In addition to that, the United States transfers B-29 bombers to Britain. B-29 bombers carry atomic bombs. The U.S. has a policy of neither confirming nor denying whether any ship or plane has atomic weapons on it. In fact, whenever a foreign government says these carrying atomic weapons, the U.S. said we will neither confirm nor deny. But clearly everyone at the time understood that these probably were armed. So the U.S. is preparing, ramping up for a major conflict over Berlin. Everyone thinks that war is quite possible, if not likely. What does Stalin do when faced with this American response? Nothing. He doesn't in any way try to impinge upon the airlifts. No American planes are shot at. No attempt is made in any way to take over control of West Berlin. And after 324 days, what does Stalin do? He lifts the siege of Berlin. Again, as in Iran, as in most other instances, the Soviet Union blinks when faced with American power. The USSR bails. Stalin, after the initial desperate and foolish act of trying to shut off Berlin doesn't do anything. At this point, it probably backfired, if anything, because at that point, the West merged all three zones and created the FRG, the Federal Republic of Germany, that's West Germany. And then ultimately, a few months later, the Soviet Union established its own client government, the GDR, which stands for the German Democratic Republic. The FRG, known as West Germany, American Allied, the GDR, known as East Germany, Communist. Stalin had blundered badly and had suffered a decisive retreat at Berlin. In addition to that, I mean, kind of adding on to it, well, actually I'm going to flip-flop things in the outline a little bit. I want to talk about NATO and then go back. Based on the Berlin crisis and other events, the U.S., has the upper hand, especially after Stalin bails. So it acts to create a military alliance, to kind of arm itself for the Cold War. And this is the genesis of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It is a military alliance of 16 states in Europe, along with the United States, to arm itself collectively against Soviet offensive action. It's a way of saying, Stalin, look what Stalin did in Berlin. What if he tries to take over all of Europe? We have to be prepared to conflict, to combat him, to have a barrier against him. So we're going to create NATO. We're going to create this military alliance. Another reason, however, one military official said behind NATO was to build up our own military industry. So what does NATO do? It puts a big army, a multinational army, in front of any potential Soviet advance into Europe. But what else does it do? If you can have an army, what do they need? Weapons, and where are you going to get those from? You can build them. You can spend money on them, right? So this is, the term I used before, and I'll talk about it again, military Keynesianism, right? We are going to create the means by which we create institutions like the Marshall Plan or NATO to help us spend money, right? Now, there's another reason for this, okay? All right, all of these confrontations. I mean, clearly, the world is on edge, especially during Berlin. Oh my God, is this going to be another world war? The U.S. and Soviet Union, atomic weapons, and all that kind of stuff. But there's also another reason behind these so-called war scares. And the Marshall Plan and the Berlin crisis engendered great war scares. When the Soviet Union rejects the Marshall Plan, there's a coup in Czechoslovakia. The Berlin crisis, I'm saying, oh my God, there's a war scare. There's a historian who passed away a few years ago. He's kind of a very colorful figure. He's written several books, but he's really sharp too. His name was Frank Kofsky, and he wrote a book called the Harry Truman and the War Scare of 1948. And what Kofsky suggested was that all of these crises were actually invented, that they weren't real, in order to get money from Congress and to keep the Americans in line, to have them support a big military buildup, which probably wasn't needed. The United States had to, as Vandenberg said during the Greece crisis, scare the hell out of the American people. Right? So what Kofsky is arguing is that the Marshall Plan and the Berlin crisis essentially served America's needs because they enabled the United States to go to the people and say, if we don't do this, we're in trouble. There is a grave threat out there coming from the Soviet Union, and unless we respond as forcefully as possible with a huge military buildup, then we will make ourselves vulnerable. All right? In particular, Kofsky was suggesting that these war scares were contrived in order to protect the aircraft industry. During the war, all right, air power had kind of come into its own. It had matured. And so the United States has spent a great deal of money building up its air capabilities. There wasn't an independent Air Force yet. It was still a wing of the Army Air Corps. Once the war ended, however, what happens? What happens to the aircraft industry? It suffers a major decline because at the time you don't have all these major consumer carriers. You don't have Continental and United and Hooters Airline. So you start to lose money. The aircraft industry is in real trouble. Now, as part of the National Security Act of 1947, an independent Air Force is created, and it needs to expand its mission. So the Air Force and the aircraft industry get together, and they say, we're in trouble. We're really in trouble. We need to figure out some way to get out of this horrible slump that we're in. Aircraft carriers are losing money. Many of them are going out of business. So what they do is go to Congress and say, you need a big Air Force, because look at these crises. We carry atomic bombs. In modern wars, we're going to be the service that's most important. You don't want to fight the Soviet Union on the plains of Europe, do you? No, you want to bomb the hell out of them from the sky. Look what we did to Tokyo. Look what we did to Dresden. Look what we did to Hiroshima, right? So this becomes really important. So these military people, especially with the Air Force, these aircraft industry representatives, these CEOs, get together and basically, working with politicians, concoct, this is what Kofsky says, and I think he's onto something, they concoct these crises in order to get support for these vastly expanded programs. Right? The Pentagon said, this is from the Pentagon, at the end of 1948, the aircraft industry was in its best financial condition since the end of the war. Sales from the 16 major airframe manufacturers reached a post-war high in 1948 of about $1.2 billion, compared with $856 million in 1947 and $730 million in 1946. Only 3 manufacturers lost money in 1948, while 11 of the 16 manufacturers operated at a loss during 1947. This is more than that. I mean, Kofsky makes a 300-page reasoned argument. But what he's suggesting is that war scares have an economic basis, that the Cold War had an economic basis, that the Soviet threat was used to legitimate these massive infusions of public capital into these military-related industries. All right? This isn't anything terribly different than what I've been suggesting all along with regard to the Marshall Plan and the dollar gap and everything else. All right? All right. If you have a particular industry and you want to bail it out, how do you do that? Do you simply hand the aircraft industry $1 billion and say, here, have fun with it? No. You create the need for them to purchase goods. All right? And the aircraft industry and the Air Force and retire. I mean, and you know what it's like. It's still the same system today, where somebody retires from the military and becomes an executive or a lobbyist for one of the major defense firms. Whether it be General Dynamics or I can't remember what they are. There have been so many mergers anymore. I used to have my whole rap down Martin Marietta and Honeywell. I don't think any of them are around anymore. I know General Dynamics is. Halliburton. I mean, Cheney and Halliburton. That's what better example than that, right? So. There is clearly an economic incentive and an economic boom to come out of this. I mean, military spending rises dramatically in this period based on these threats posed by the Soviet Union. Now, at the same time that the U.S. is selling these threats, what were Dean Acheson and others saying? That the Soviet Union would have to be out of its mind to act aggressively. And what was Stalin doing in Iran, in Berlin, and elsewhere? He was bailing out in Germany and China. He's bailing out, right? So clearly, the threat that the U.S. was suggesting did not exist, and that's not me saying that in 2004. That's what those guys were saying in the 40s. If you look at the records, clearly part of them are alarmist, but there is clearly a concise and reasoned analysis which suggests that the U.S. is not besieged because the U.S. has far more power than the Soviet Union. In fact, what did the Soviet record show? That Stalin felt vulnerable because the balance of power was so heavily skewed against the Soviet Union. At the same time, the U.S. is using these crises, which it concocts, in order to legitimate this massive arms race, which people like Niels Bohr and Oppenheimer saw coming before the atomic bomb was even developed. Okay? So one could reasonably argue that these war scares and things like NATO really were devised in order to maintain America's economic hegemony. All right. Now I have a little parenthetical thing there. If the outline were up, it says the end of the Cold War with a bunch of question marks, and I put this on there just kind of as a way to kind of ask you to think about certain things. See, in the basic discourse, the Cold War ends when? I mean, if I said when did the Cold War end, what would you say? 89, 91. Yeah, right. Berlin Wall, Gorbachev, whatever. That would be the basic discourse. The Cold War ending. All right. What I'm suggesting is something actually quite different and perhaps quite radical. I'm suggesting the Cold War ended in 1949. Okay, not in Asia. We'll talk about that, but in Europe, which is really where everything was happening. I mean, Europe was the big leagues, right? Right? Everywhere else was kind of AAA, but Europe is the big leagues. The Cold War is basically over. Okay? After the Berlin crisis, after the formation of NATO, right? What happens? Does the Soviet Union, and one could argue it never acted aggressively really before that, but after 1948-49, what instances do you see of the Soviet Union acting in any way adventurously? You don't. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about that too. Actually, well, no, I mean, I don't want to kind of get too far out of the chronology. In both of those cases, I think that there's all kinds of other dynamics at play. And you might, you could make an exemption for Cuba. I think Afghanistan, I don't think you can, actually. I think what the Soviet Union did there actually makes a lot of sense. It was stupid, but it makes a lot of sense. Cuba would be the one, perhaps, exemption you would make to that, where you would say, oh, they acted adventurously. On the other hand, that takes into all kinds of questions about sovereignty and kind of reciprocity because of what the U.S. was doing in Europe and so forth. When we get to that point, we'll bring that up again. But I mean, the point is that the Cold War, I mean, clearly there's this state of siege, right? But in fact, if you look at precipitous action, you don't really see it. I mean, after the Berlin crisis, after the formation of NATO, the lines in Europe are clearly drawn. And actually, what I'm talking about is the Cold War in Europe, not necessarily, Cuba is a different theater. But the lines are clearly drawn by 1948-49. And you see does the Soviet Union try to do anything in Italy and in France and Greece? No. There are indigenous communist parties supported by the USSR. But even then, what they're doing is trying to get elected. They run in elections. Right? So you don't see any kind of Iran or Germany or Berlin type confrontations after this period. Clearly, NATO, the balance of power, the disposition of forces is so great that even though containment of the Soviet Union will remain the operative principle, the doctrine for the next 40 years, the Cold War is basically done. It's set. I mean, the lines are drawn and they're not going to change. They're not terribly flexible. They're not going to be erased. I mean, the Soviet Union will develop an atomic bomb. It will develop a hydrogen bomb. By no means am I suggesting that it didn't have a military capacity to inflict harm. But the real opportunities and the real chances and the likelihood of that happening are very, very, very limited. And what we're seeing now as more and more documents come out is that Americans essentially understood that. The U.S. always understood that it had a massive balance of power, advantage against the Soviet Union in Europe. All right? So, I mean, and this is just something to ponder. I mean, most people think that I'm wrong, quite frankly, when I talk about this. But I really think that, one could make a reasoned argument that the Cold War was basically done in Europe by this time. And the U.S. won. I mean, the U.S. won. I don't think there's any question about that, So, I mean, this kind of upsets that whole Ronald Reagan hagiography too. Reagan won the Cold War. Hell, Truman won the Cold War. If you define it in the terms they use, which is to have this overwhelming power to be able to kind of act in the world precipitously, to act without fear, of being challenged by an enemy force, then they won. Because the Soviet Union doesn't stop the U.S. Where does it do that? I mean, it tinkers in Cuba and Nicaragua and places like that, but realistically, the U.S. has global hegemony, incredible global hegemony, and the one place where it actually is confronted and thwarted is actually in Asia, which we'll talk about in a minute. But in terms of Europe, I just don't see it. So, anyway, something to think about. Yeah.
Hadn't the whole Cold War scare and everything been over with until, or forgotten about, and then when Reagan came in and he started, talking smack about
Well, I mean,
Russia
there had been,
everything.
no, I mean, I think the Vietnam War was all about the Cold War. You did have this period of détente with Nixon and Kissinger.
Right, there was a period of time where it was just basically...
There was about a decade, and Reagan clearly, escalated. There's no question about that. And I mean, when we get to that, we'll talk about it. I mean, Reagan, just like Reagan knew the Soviet Union was in trouble. I mean, everybody who understood the USSR knew that by 1980 the Soviet Union was in dire shape. I mean, its demise. Guys who knew, CIA people who really understood it said they're in their last legs, they're in trouble. And this is in the mid-70s. The U.S. didn't want to hear that because that takes away their major reason. I mean, that was actually Daddy Bush, 41, was a big player in that, where they basically killed the intelligence. And they said, we don't want this. We don't want you to tell us the Soviet Union's in trouble, because then we lose, our credible reasons to do, to build up our own, whatever. So, but that's, just something to think about. All right. So pretty much that's Europe and the Cold War, and that takes us up to around 1950. I want to very briefly talk about Latin America, and then probably spend more time on Asia, because I think that's very important too in many ways. I mean, that's where the Cold War gets hot. It's not really a Cold War in Asia. It's a war. Korea, Vietnam, China. So it's very important. But I'll talk a little bit about Latin America, because I talked about it with the good neighbor policy. All right, what's the fallout of that? Remember, prior to the war, Roosevelt announces the U.S. will act like a good neighbor, and this is mainly a tactical shift. The U.S. doesn't, abnegate its role as hegemon in the region. It doesn't say we're not going to, abide by the Monroe Doctrine anymore or anything like that. What the U.S. suggests in Latin America is that it will now act differently. It won't intervene and invade all over the place. And in fact, in the period right after World War II, as with much of the world, there was a flourishing, briefly, of kind of democratic institutions, labor unions, socialist parties, communist parties, and whatnot. However, and this is what's important, because you see this happening throughout the world, by 1947 and 48, the old order, the old regime, the forces of order, whatever you want to call it, comes back in and restores authority. Right? Ending Latin hopes for democracy at that point. So whenever the U.S. sees nations essentially exercising their sovereignty by trying to establish free trade unions, by electing people to office who are part of the political left, socialist, communist, or whatever, the U.S. comes in to restore order. They don't welcome these developments, even though rhetorically they're talking about democracy. When these people exercise democracy, as Henry Kissinger would later say, irresponsibly, then the U.S. takes action. American intelligence understood there was no threat of any communist control anywhere in Latin America. They understood that clearly. That the rigid authoritarian and military governments throughout Latin America had clear control. And I mean, Dave Schmitz's book, Thank God They're on Our Side, shows this convincingly, that the U.S. clearly has a close relationship with these military governments, these right-wing governments, these dictatorships throughout Latin America. So there's no threat that American interests are going to actually be seriously challenged in this. Still, the U.S. takes action to contain any activity that might make American interest less safe, whether that be nationalism or social welfare programs or political reform. And we'll talk about that. I mean, you'll see that in Guatemala, in Cuba, and in Chile, and in Nicaragua, you name it, right? The United States, for instance, when the UN, the United Nations, was established, the United States secured language in the UN Charter which recognized the Monroe Doctrine. And Senator Arthur Vandenberg said, "We have preserved the Monroe Doctrine and the inter-American system. We have retained a complete veto, exclusive in our own hands, over any decisions involving external activities." The UN is supposed to be based on the idea of collective action, yet you have Vandenberg boasting about a complete veto over decision involving external activities. In addition to that, in 1947, the U.S. and Latin leaders concluded something called the Rio Pact, which said that an attack on one country is an attack on all. Collective security. A year after that, in 1948, the United States and Latin countries created the OAS, the Organization of American States. The Latin Americans want to assert their sovereignty. The OAS was created in Bogota in 48, and the OAS condemns international communism, which barely existed in Latin America at the time. But the Latin leaders, and this goes back to, remember, the Salvadoran delegate in the 33 meeting in Havana, who talked about sovereignty issues. Article 15 of the OAS Charter said, "No state or group of states has the right to intervene, directly or indirectly, for any reason whatever, in the internal or external affairs of any other state. The foregoing principle prohibits not only armed force, but also any other form of interference or attempted threat against the personality of the state or against its political, economic, and cultural elements." What does that mean? I don't want to have to repeat it. But it's pretty clear cut. What's that mean? What are they agreeing to in the OAS Charter? Yeah.
They're trying to get rid of American interventions.
Exactly. They are saying no state has the right to intervene, not only militarily, but politically, right? I think, the reason I put this up here, because the Rio Pact and OAS sound great, right? They are going to restrain the United States. However, as we'll see time and again, the United States will violate the OAS and the Rio Pact, which is, kind of one of the geneses of the whole anti-Americanism that really takes root after Castro's revolution in the 60s and 70s. The kind of whole "why do they hate us" syndrome and anti-Yankee go home, right? Yankee go home has been said a lot before that, but clearly that's part of it. So Latin America, you can kind of see the same dynamic where the U.S. is going to assert its hegemony, this time under the aegis of the Monroe Doctrine. All right. Asia is real important because, as I said, in Asia the Cold War isn't cold; it turns hot. All right. Two important areas there, obviously China and Japan. We'll start with China because it's a big story. In China, the government there is led by a man named Jiang Jieshi, also known as Chiang Kai-shek. And his political party, the governing party, is the Guomindang. At the time, Kuomintang, KMT. If you ever see KMT, that's the Guomindang. They've changed the transliterations. That's the government. And they're getting billions of dollars in aid from the United States. This is the government that was invaded by the Japanese, right? The Guomindang. Now, from the 20s onward, there had been a political force opposed to the Guomindang. And that's the CCP, which stands for Chinese Communist Party, and that's led by Mao Zedong, a name with which I'm sure you're all familiar. All right. The United States is a heavy supporter of the Guomindang. Jiang Jieshi was a Christian. He had good connections to American missionaries, but in addition to that, he had great connections to American businessmen and American cultural icons like Henry Luce. Anybody know who Henry Luce is? Publisher, huge publisher, right? The biggest publisher at the time. He would be, and no one can, it would be like the Time Warner of today or something like that, The Luce Publishing Empire, Time, Life, everything, right? And Henry Luce was a big supporter of Jiang Jieshi. So Jiang Jieshi was getting billions of dollars in support from the United States. The American religious community supported him. The American media supported him heavily. The only problem is that Jiang Jieshi was despised and corrupt. He took the money and basically pocketed it. The Chinese people hated him. Instead of fighting against Japan, he was fighting against the communists. And in fact, the mantle of legitimacy in China really rested upon Mao Zedong and the Chinese communists who were attacking the Guomindang and had been for some time. Now, you have a classic case here, right? This free market government, Jiang Jieshi, beset upon by these communists, Mao Zedong. All right, how does the world look at this? This is what's interesting. This is what's important. First, let's go to Joe Stalin, who I just went on great length about, talking about how kind of conservative Stalin was. Let's use China as a test case. Stalin never liked Mao Zedong and never liked the communists. In fact, he always preferred to have the Guomindang and Jiang Jieshi in power. Why? Because they were weaker. They wouldn't threaten him. Okay? So Stalin, the communist, had always supported the Guomindang in the 1920s and 1930s. In 1945, at Yalta, Stalin agreed that the legitimate government of China, which deserved Allied support, was the government of Jiang Jieshi, the Guomindang. Stalin, and Mao's pissed off. Mao was so angry because, actually he was more popular and was doing quite well. However, Stalin agrees to continue supporting the Guomindang and Jiang Jieshi against Mao Zedong. All right? The Soviet Union continually, in the late 40s, tries to subdue the Chinese Communist Party. And even in 1949, when the Communists finally win, at the last minute, the whole world knew that the Communists were going to win the civil war in China. Even at that point, Mao Zedong was still trying to divide. The Soviet Union still wanted China to divide power between Mao and Jiang. All right, to have kind of a two Chinas kind of thing. All right, this is how much Stalin and Mao didn't get along. So this whole kind of Stalin adventuresome thing kind of falls apart when you look at China. All right, now Conversely, this is the way the Soviet Union looks at China. They say, Jiang Jieshi's in charge. We can live with that. We've got no problem with that. What's the U.S. think? I say Marshall there, but George Marshall is kind of I'm using him as kind of a collective title for the American view. See, the Americans are well aware of what's happening in China. Now, you get the public view, the so-called China lobby. There's a group, the loose publishing empire, especially people who support Jiang Jieshi, and they're talking about how great he is, and he's a good Christian. He goes to church, and he has a beautiful wife, and all this, wonderful, stuff about the Chinese. However, Americans in China are coming back with a different story. The China hands refer to State Department officials who are experts in China, people like John Peyton Davies and John Stewart Service, and George Marshall, who's both Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, has a special mission. They sent him to China, I think, for almost a year. It's quite some time. And Marshall and the China hands and everyone there associated with China comes back to Hiroshima with the same message. And what's the message? Is it, we like Chiang Kai-shek? Is it the same message that Stalin's giving? No. In fact, Stalin is supporting the American ally. And the American representatives in China are coming back and saying, this guy sucks. Jiang Jieshi is inefficient. He's corrupt. He's ripping off the people. He's taking all the money we give him and he's pocketing it. He's not fighting against the Japanese. Mao is actually doing that. No one likes him. He's not going to win. We're backing, the wrong horse. We're backing, this old kind of, glue factory horse. And in fact, so is Stalin. And in fact, Mao is going to win. And we don't like it. We don't like Mao Zedong, but we better take account of the fact that Mao is more popular and, as the 40s go on, increasingly likely to win this thing. This is what Marshall's saying. This is what the China hands are saying. This is what pretty much everybody who knows anything is saying. Marshall actually comes back with a fairly decent impression of the communists. He said they negotiated in good faith, whereas the Guomindang act like a bunch of feudal lords, right? This is George Marshall saying this, not Joe Stalin, right? Maybe McCarthy was right about Marshall, right?
What's this Joe Stilwell going is? What did Joe Stilwell saying about?
That's almost the setup. Stilwell was the American official to the Guomindang. He was a general, Vinegar Joe. Joe Stilwell referred to Chiang Kai-shek in front of him as Little Peanut. He said, "Hey, Little Peanut, come here." He called his wife the Dragon Lady, the Oriental stereotype. Stilwell hated Chiang Kai-shek. He just despised him, and didn't have a good word to say about him. And he was Vinegar Joe. He was just real salty,
What's his title? What's Stilwell's role in Asia?
He's a special advisor. I don't remember the exact title. Yeah, he's a general. Yeah, he's a special advisor. He was an envoy.
Was he Commander General of U.S. Forces in that theater?
In the Asian theater, I don't know. I thought he was he may have been, but then after the war, at the end of the war, he becomes a special envoy. Yeah, he hated Chiang Kai-shek. I mean, he thought he was ridiculous. He was really insensitive. He would literally refer to them as Little Peanut and the Dragon Lady in front of them. He called other people more harsh things, which if the class weren't televised, I would say, but I get in enough trouble already. So. But Stilwell, pretty much anybody who understood Asia, who was on the ground in China, whether it be State Department officials or Marshall, anybody, came back with the same message. Yeah.
What was Stalin's problem with Mao?
He didn't want a rival. China's bigger than the Soviet Union, right? He's going to, Stalin's the bomb among communists. He doesn't know if he can trust Mao Zedong. He doesn't want a rival for communist power. And in addition to that, the one thing about Chiang Kai-shek is very weak. He's not a threat to the Soviet Union. It's a fractured country. It's divided among really kind of a warlordish system almost. There's no real threat of China, unifying and becoming a major threat to the Soviet Union, which shares a border, right? Big border. Whereas Mao, you never know.
Some books that I've read said that it was Mao's desire to go to war with the United States that actually put Stalin off, because Stalin was more into the balance of power kind of thing.
He's suggesting that books he's read suggest that Mao was taking a harder line against the U.S., willing to go to war, which put Stalin off because Stalin believed in kind of the balance of power. This is an area that's in constant flux. I'm not persuaded by that. In fact, I think Stalin actually was quite, was open to accommodations. I mean, if like I said, just Marshall said the communists negotiated in good faith. It was the Guomindang he had problems with. You see that, I think, particularly in the 50s, when you do see a different line coming out of Beijing, especially with regard to Korea, where they intervene. But in the 40s, I don't think so. I think again, Mao understood the balance of power. Why get the U.S. angry at you in the 40s? So basically, the people who know better come back with a fairly positive appraisal of Mao Zedong and the communists. All right, it's really this two-pronged thing. On one hand, the so-called experts, if you want to call them experts, the military and diplomatic people, all come back saying Mao Zedong's going to win. You might not like it, but he's going to win. Then you have the kind of China lobby at home, the kind of media and political people who say, no, we have to support Chiang Kai-shek with everything we have. My favorite among these, which I say just because it's a great quote, is a senator from Nebraska named Kenneth Wary, who said on the floor of the U.S. Senate, with God's help, we will lift Shanghai up and up, ever up, until it is just like Kansas City. So, I'm sure the people of China thank him for that. Despite this kind of visionary rhetoric, American money to China was essentially poured down a rat hole. The U.S. sends billions of dollars, enough military equipment to aid and equip 30 divisions just to maintain Jiang Jiexi's position. $2 billion, okay, which is a lot of money. What's the 17 to 130? What's that, a factor of about 8? So do 2, that's like $16 billion today. All right, and 30 divisions. And Chiang Kai-shek doesn't do anything with it, right? He's incapable of using that efficiently. By 1949, the U.S. had sent over $3 billion to the Guomindang just since 45. So between 45 and 49, the U.S. sends over $3 billion to the Guomindang. Nonetheless, it doesn't do any good. The Civil War continues to go badly. American, as I said, people like Marshall, American political leaders, conservative senators, all oppose it. Marshall, by mid-48, is still concerned. He says, I'm worried about, his words are, getting sucked in to the Chinese Civil War. All right? American military leaders like Generals Albert Wiedemeyer and Omar Bradley are worried that if the United States sends military advisors to China, they'll get dragged into the war. They don't want to do that. Marshall says, look, if we really want to get rid of communism in China, we're going to have to take over the whole country. We can't do that. So there's really a recognition there that there's not a whole lot the U.S. can do. Right, by the experts. Doesn't matter. The American politicians, Truman and others, continue to support Jiang Jieshi. Dean Acheson and others go along with it. By the autumn of 1949, despite billions of dollars going in to China, Jiang Jieshi's days were numbered and he fled to Taiwan. And on October 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong stood up in Tiananmen Square and proclaimed the establishment of a new country, the People's Republic of China. The biggest country on the globe had just turned communist, the second major communist state. This is a massive failure of American policy, probably the biggest failure, the biggest tragedy perhaps of American foreign policy. The current stuff going on in the Mideast could probably surpass this, actually, I think. But given the nature of American support, it was basically inevitable. Because, one would think that the U.S., by giving billions of dollars to a foreign government, would have leverage over that government, right? So, and one of the points that people like Marshall and others were making was, if you're going to give Jiang Jieshi this money, then make him clean up his act. But see, Jiang Jieshi actually had the tiger by the tail, Mao would later say, because even though he was the recipient of such aid, that actually gives him leverage and power, right? How? How does being so dependent give you power? The U.S. was never going to leave him out there, and he knew that. He could do anything, and the U.S., because what was the alternative? You're going to take a communist? You're going to support Mao Zedong? Jiang knew that would never happen. In addition to that, the U.S. had invested so heavily in him that they couldn't bail out. So Jiang Jieshi is the recipient of this massive infusion of American welfare and knows that he doesn't have to do anything about it, and actually takes much of it to Taiwan with him. His son became, after he died in what was it, the early 70s, his son took over and Taiwan is actually, I think, moving to a multi-party system now. But Jiang Jieshi actually, he basically had the Americans by the tail and was able to take advantage of that. Now, when we get to that point, you'll see there's a huge domestic fallout from this. Harry Truman lost China. This is basically what the China lobby and the Republicans say. Jiang Jieshi was a great man, and you didn't support him. What did they want? I'm not really sure, because short of direct military involvement, there wasn't anything else the U.S. really could have done. Yeah.
In regards to Japan, were they still after
The Japanese? Well, no. I mean, after World War II, they're wiped out. We'll talk about that. They're kicked out of everywhere. The Japanese, no. No, the Soviet Union is more interested in Manchuria than... And actually, Manchuria was a communist stronghold. There's a... Well, here, actually, I do have a map, which is kind of cool because it's one of those things that kind of, if it works... Yeah, see? You get to see the red tide flowing across. But you can see, I think it starts in 45. Manchuria was actually the stronghold for the communists. So, isn't that cool? I can just sit here and look at this all day, man. Yeah, isn't it? The red tide flowing across. Yeah. I don't want to turn it off, man. It's just so...
Didn't they help us with the battle and that, like, we were upset that they went into Manchuria?
The communists?
Yeah.
Yeah, the communists fought with the, the U.S., in fact, hustled Guomindang troops into northern China to accept the surrender from the Japanese, because the communists had basically defeated the Japanese and were about to accept the surrender, and you don't want that, right? So the Americans hustled Guomindang troops into the north to accept the surrender from Japan. So yeah, I mean, this is a client state, a classic client state, and everyone knows it. There's a heavy fallout. I mean, Truman pays the piper. He lost China. This is going to be one of the reasons for McCarthyism. In addition to that, this is clearly going to have an impact on what happens in Korea and Vietnam. All right, Mao's victory will. Any questions on that? All right, Japan. Went through that quickly. I'll go through this quickly too. And this is really a continuation of stuff we've talked about at great length already, right? China and Japan. We already know the story there. Open door, Japan's special relationship with China. Yeah. All right, the war ends. What's happened? Japan, like Germany, like the Soviet Union, like these major combatants, is really devastated by World War II. Perhaps 3 million Japanese were killed during the war. The Allied attacks destroyed a huge percentage of Japan's national wealth, 80% of Japan's ships, a third of its industrial plant, over 60 major cities were destroyed, leveled, and millions upon millions were left homeless. Japan has been reduced more or less to rubble. There's a documentary out about Robert McNamara called Fog of War. Has anybody seen that? All right. At the very beginning, McNamara was actually part of the team that surveyed Japan. And I think the best part of the documentary actually is these scenes from Japan, which show Japanese cities and have the name of a comparable U.S. city there. So they'll show like Kyoto or something and say Salt Lake City, 78% destroyed or something like that. And you get some sense of the massive devastation of Japan. I mean, Hiroshima and Nagasaki actually weren't the worst. I mean, I think the firebombing of Tokyo actually probably was far more destructive than Hiroshima was. I think. Do you have a question? Or?
Yeah, how many Americans were killed?
World War II?
Other foreigners in their bombings in Japan, Hiroshima, and all that.
In World War II?
Right.
There were some American POWs who I believe, I think there were, the question was how many Americans were killed. You mean like POWs and things? Right. I mean, there were some, I don't know what the numbers are. It's not huge, not a large amount. But there were some American POWs, I believe, was it in Hiroshima or Nagasaki? It was in Hiroshima, right. 15? Okay, who were killed. But the big, kind of propaganda item was always the way that the Japanese treated American POWs, like the Bataan Death March. And as I said last week, the best book on that is by John Dower, which shows that the war in Asia did have these kind of racial overtones, which were really ugly on both sides, yeah. But other than the POWs, I don't know, there may have been, I don't know, but not a lot. Not a whole lot. And in fact, the fire bombings of Tokyo were way more destructive than the atomic bomb was. But the point here is that Japan is kind of wiped out. Now, the Americans look at Japan in much the same way that they look at Germany, right? I mean, Europe is obviously way more important than Asia, but nonetheless, the U.S. has real interest in seeing Japan revived too. One American official says, if we revive Japan, that can become a bulwark against the Soviet Union. It will assure the U.S. of sources of strategic raw materials. Remember last week when I read the percentages of raw materials, of vital raw materials that the U.S. was getting out of Asia, with the exception of petroleum, almost everything of value that the U.S. needed in terms of strategic raw materials was coming out of Asia. And it will deny the Soviet Union the manpower potential of the Far East, basically meaning China. This is before the fall of China. So, like Germany and Europe, Japan can become the linchpin of America's economic globalizing mission in Asia. John Peyton Davies, a very well-known China hand, Asian expert, said that Japan would not only thwart communism in Asia, and the real point of supporting Japan is twofold, and we already know what they are. One, to maintain American markets. Two, to make sure that communism doesn't come in. And after 49, that's even more important. But John Peyton Davies says not only will it thwart communism, but Japan is important not just for American trade and investment, but Japan will trade in and invest in other Asian countries. Now, when James talks about Vietnam, he's going to talk about this, aren't you? Because this is in many ways why Vietnam is important. Vietnam is really a very poor and essentially, irrelevant country to the United States. However, as part of this kind of reconstruction of Asia, Vietnam is very important because it becomes a market for Japan and becomes a source of raw materials. So Vietnam is important to the U.S., it's important to Japan, and Japan is important to the U.S. Wouldn't you agree? Yeah. More on that later. Coming up at 11. So Japan is important in the reconstruction, not just of Japan, but in all of Southeast Asia, which is clearly vital to the United States. So how's the U.S. going to do this? It does it a little bit differently than Germany. The U.S. actually asserts far greater control in Japan than it does in Germany, although the U.S. did have a military government in Germany led by Lucius Clay. In Japan, it's led by Douglas MacArthur. And ironically, for the first couple years of the occupation, from 45 to 47, two things, a lot of things going on, but two things are worth noting. One, the Japanese actually kind of welcome this. One of the best-known books on it, also by John Dower, is called Embracing Defeat. The Japanese essentially see the error of their ways and want to kind of rehabilitate themselves. They embrace their defeat, and they work closely with the Americans to create kind of American-type institutions. Secondly, MacArthur, who's really a hardcore right-winger. I mean, Franklin Roosevelt thought MacArthur was a fascist. MacArthur actually institutes a liberal system in Japan, kind of a new deal for Japan. Women get the vote, and labor unions are recognized, and women are allowed to get own property, and money is spent on higher education, and workers get health insurance and benefits, and union membership, which was basically non-existent, goes up to 7 million. So what you see in Japan from like 45 to 47 is actually the institution of very liberal reforms. All right. A backlash begins, though, by 47 and 48. The links aren't explicit, but you've got to believe that what's happening in China affects Japan as well. As things turn worse, as things go south even more badly in China, then the need to crack down in Japan will become greater. And in fact, the backlash begins. There had been a series of strikes in Japan. MacArthur believes the communists are leading them, so MacArthur outlaws strikes. And then he begins to repeal a lot of the workers' rights that had been given them. And as the CCP in China, as the communists in China do well, you can kind of see things in Japan become more difficult. Labor rights are restricted. The military-industrial complex in Japan kind of becomes greater in terms of military-related items. Japan actually doesn't have a military as a result of the the truce to end the war, the treaty to end the war. Japan quits enforcing antitrust laws, bars leftists from public office, and so forth. So the Americans call these Cold War considerations, and so they abandoned this liberalization program and actually become more conservative, more rightists. They depurge a lot of wartime leaders and let them re-enter politics. So you start to see, as I said, a renazification in Germany. You start to see the same thing in Japan. The very people who had been responsible for Japanese aggression in the 30s and 40s are starting to emerge again in the late 40s. All right. Now this represents a big shift in American thinking on Japan, away from punitive measures toward reconstructive measures. A lot of Japanese businessmen had welcomed the U.S. in. They had embraced defeat, seeing these Western influences in this development as a way to modernize, to rebuild after this very devastating war. So the Japanese say, come in, teach us, show us what to do, tell us what to do. So they believe that the American occupation would be the best thing for them to, try to achieve a greater standard of living. The American business community wants the Japanese to adopt Western ways, but they have a different vision. They don't foresee Japan becoming a major industrial giant. They want the Japanese to basically import and make and export cheap stuff. Nowadays, you grew up in a culture where everything's from Japan, right? I mean, cars and VCRs and video games and everything. Growing up when I did, stuff from Japan was kind of had a negative connotation to it. Little transistor radio, stuff like that, made in Japan, ha ha ha. That was Japan's role after World War II, to make cheap junk, basically. It's kind of like China in the dollar store today, right? This was the idea that Japan would become the workshop of Asia, make small goods like transistor radios and small appliances and things like that, which would be sold elsewhere as a way for Japan to get export money, to get currency that way. So it was an entirely different vision. It didn't envision Japan in any way becoming an economic revival. It envisioned Japan becoming a workshop, making goods for other Asian countries, and essentially five and dime store kind of stuff for the United States. All right? So Japan was forced at that time to accept the dominant role of the U.S. in the global economy. It wanted to create its own kind of economic future, but the U.S. Essentially insists upon the Japanese becoming, this workshop for these small consumer goods. The Korean War, to jump ahead a bit, really is important for Japan because this is really the reason for Japan's revitalization, because they start to make military equipment for the Korean Army, and the Korean War is really very important that way. So the Japanese industrial revival is a result of the Korean War, but to jump ahead, in the 70s and 80s, there's going to be this huge anti-Japanese, hysteria in the United States. Japanese cars and Japanese this and Japanese bashing. We need tariffs. We need quotas. Right? This is a real shift away from the initial American view of Japan, which was that it would become an Asian economic power. It would contain Chinese communism. It would be the basis for globalization in the Pacific region. And again, as with Germany, it works. I mean, people in the 70s would say, "Oh, we don't like the Japanese," but in fact, the investment was well worth it because the U.S. is able to use Japan to create a foothold in Asia, to become an Asian economic power in that period. I've gone through this Asian stuff fairly quickly. Does anybody have any questions? I mean, we'll talk more about it as things go on. All right. All right. Oops, wrong one. Oh, yeah, definitely. Definitely. All right. I want to kind of shift gears now and talk about what's going on at home, and I won't finish this today, but I'll get a start on it. Okay, we've seen what happened abroad, and I don't want to kind of go through into great detail and recap it. I think it kind of speaks for itself. But clearly, between 1945 and 1950, in Europe and in Asia, the United States has increased its levels of power and influence. In Europe, through things like the Truman Doctrine or Marshall Plan, the United States has basically facilitated the economic reconstruction of Europe, but has done it in a way to make those countries dependent upon the U.S. as part of this global political economy. You saw this during the war at Bretton Woods, and you certainly see it afterward with things like the Marshall Plan or NATO. All right. At the same time, the Soviet Union, understanding its weakened position in the global balance of power, does not act aggressively outside of its own very secure Iron Curtain perimeter in Eastern Europe, does not act aggressively, and when it does in places like Iran and Berlin, it immediately retreats. So clearly the U.S. has a decided advantage, I would argue, a victory in the Cold War in Asia. In addition to that, the American political economy is at its apex, controlling massive percentages of global trade and output, using mechanisms like the Marshall Plan as a way to deal with the dollar gap, to get money into the hands of Europeans so they can use it to come back and buy stuff guaranteed from the United States, guaranteeing U.S. markets. So this is all taking shape by 1950, and the United States by 1950s, man, it is the global economic power without any serious rivals. It's a global military power. It has an atomic bomb, although not a monopoly anymore. In 1950, the United States has massive global power. Enough said. Right? What's happening at home as a result of the Cold War? The Cold War also becomes the justification not only for this global expansion, but for a kind of restructuring of American political life, American society. Right? And traditional American ideas of freedom and liberty and democracy clearly are now affected by the Cold War. And pretty much this is the standard discourse in pretty much anything you read about it now. The Cold War has a massive impact on the way people live their lives, on American society, on American freedoms, American liberties, American democracy. As a result of the Cold War, we have what a lot of critics and supporters alike refer to as the establishment of a national security state. Okay, have any of you ever heard that phrase, national security state? No? National security state implies a lot of things, and we'll spend more time on it. But the national security state essentially means that the United States government and American society are now essentially directed toward a militaristic culture. We have a political system and a culture based on militarism. That the government's major role is to keep us secure, national security. Everything becomes a security threat. All right? We need to be vigilant all the time now as a result of the Cold War, as a result of the Soviet Union, as a result of this enemy country having atomic bombs, as a result of the Chinese Civil War. We need to be vigilant. There are communists everywhere. We need to be secure. We can't demobilize and have a civilian culture and then wait for the next crisis and remobilize like the U.S. did before World War I and II. Remember, in the periods before World War I and II, there was almost no military establishment. The U.S. had to, kind of ramp up really quickly with drafts and mobilization. That's not going to happen anymore. We need a permanent military establishment. That also means that we have to change our political system and perhaps even change our conceptions of liberty and democracy in order to be prepared for these alien enemy ideologies who are always going to be attacking us, whether politically or militarily. We can't allow people to be so free and open that they would, create vulnerabilities. We can't have communists in the United States. We can't have terrorist groups in the United States. We can't have the Black Panthers. We can't have Arab Americans running around. These are all products of the Cold War. The Patriot Act or COINTELPRO or McCarthyism are all products of this sense that there's a dangerous world. The world's a dangerous place, and there are people out there who want to hurt you. There's Reds everywhere. Okay, later on it'll be somebody else. Today, Arabs and Muslims, but in the 40s and 50s, there's Reds. Okay, and the Reds are out to get you. It's like after World War I, but much, much worse. All right. So we need to create the means to be able to thwart that. We need to create a state which promotes security, a national security state. This occurs on many levels. I want to talk about a couple points which are fairly important. The first one I'll go through fairly quickly. It's something that I'm deeply interested in. I could spend a lot of time on it, but I'll go through it quickly. And it's about the role of organized labor, because I think this is really important. Basically, progressive states which have a progressive political economy, meaning welfare programs, minimum wage laws, heavy unionism, programs to provide jobs and government spending, public spending. States like that generally have a strong labor presence, or a labor or leftist party. If you look at Britain, which has a labor party, allegedly with Tony Blair, but before that had a labor party. France has socialist parties. Most states with progressive policies have some kind of labor left presence. It's never happened in the United States. Right? And in fact, labor was a major partner in the government's role in the Cold War. How did it do that? There were two major labor groups after World War II. They weren't merged yet, so they were separate. The AFL, the CIO, the American Federation of Labor, and the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations. They merged in '55. It's the same group now, right? However, they were separate at the time, but they were really on the same page. Right. The United States, and I talked about this a bit ago, in 1945 it surveys what's happening in Europe, and it sees unemployment and homelessness and devastation and hunger. All right. Now, who's going to take advantage of that unless something happens? Who's going to take advantage of that in Europe? The communists, the socialists, the unions. And in fact, throughout Europe there is a very strong labor movement and a very strong socialist and communist movement, and they're winning elections free and democratically, which is America's gravest threat. If there's a coup, like in Czechoslovakia, I mean, when Beneš and Masaryk were overthrown in Czechoslovakia, everybody knew who was responsible for that. The new government had no legitimacy, no credibility, right? But if there's an election and the communists win or the socialists win, man, what do you do about that? That's legitimate. That's credible. These people have chosen that, right? You know, the U.S. doesn't want that to happen, and it can't very well go into France or Italy and overthrow the government, right? So it has to find other ways to do that, and labor becomes major, important player in this. So the two major labor groups in the United States, the AFL and the CIO. The CIO was considered far more progressive, radical, actually had a lot of communists in it who were eventually kicked out. But there was also an international labor group called the WFTU, the World Federation of Trade Unions. And this is essentially communist and socialist unions which consolidate in 1945 as a federation. All of the major trade unions in the world, in the industrialized world, were members of the WFTU except for two. Guess which two? The FFL and the CIO were not in the WFTU. So on the left then you have the WFTU, these kind of socialist unions, and then on the right, essentially, you have the AFL and the CIO. Now, what does that mean in real terms? In Europe, especially in Germany and France and Italy and other places as well, but those are the biggies. Germany and France especially, Italy, big but not quite as much. But in all of those countries, the AFL and the CIO, supported with money from the State Department and later from the CIA, go in to these European countries and work very closely with the labor parties there to divide them, to discredit the communists, and in any way possible to give communist and socialist labor unions a bad name. All right? So the AFL supports America's Cold War policies, which ultimately help damage the interest of the European working class. Okay? By discrediting trade unions, by discrediting the socialists, by discrediting the communists. What the AFL and CIO do in Germany, in France, and in Italy is essentially take away the biggest support mechanism that working people have. In France, for instance, they go in there, the major union of France is called the CGT, the Confédération Générale du Travail, General Workers Confederation. What the U.S. does is go in there and fund anti-communist labor leaders, and they create a new union called the FO, the Force Ouvrière, the Workers' Force. All right? So what you have then is the Americans going in and dividing the French labor movement as a way to weaken those groups, like the socialists and communists, which were most pro-worker. All right? So the U.S. actually undermines that. It contains the European labor left. It's really quite remarkable. For instance, in France, between 44 and 46, the left, socialists and communists, regularly won over half the votes. These are free, fair, democratic elections. And that's what frightens the U.S. more than anything. Far more than Soviet hordes crashing through. What scares the U.S. is Western Europeans freely voting for socialist and communist. Right? That's what scared the hell out of Kissinger when Allende wins, or the Sandinistas. It's people choosing that. right? That's really the grave threat, because then you can't really attack that in the same way you could if the Soviet hordes crashed through the gates. So this display of strength, electoral and democratic, is a real threat. And so the U.S. labor really acts precipitously and effectively against that. One of the bigger reasons that there's not a greater radical left presence in Europe in the post-war era is the role of American labor. There's no question about that. It plays a counter-revolutionary and counter-progressive role in Europe. And this is important because you often hear American politicians going off about liberals and radicals and labor and socialists and all this, and this is just absurd, because American labor is inherently conservative and plays a vital role in helping, win the European Cold War. It's very important there. They're working close with the CIA. CIA and FFL are hand in glove. They're on the same side, right? And these are radicals. Labor's always had a very conservative, hawkish foreign policy. That's one part of it. Another part, which I'll just start and then we'll pick up next time, is the National Security Act. Labor's involvement in the Cold War in Europe was clearly important, and it showed how containment had permeated so much of American society. Then even labor, allegedly this progressive force, actually has a vital role to play in the Cold War. These lines that we would think exist between domestic and foreign, between civilian and military and diplomatic forces, have all been blurred or erased as a result of the Cold War. So labor, which is supposed to be a progressive force at home, can play this really counter-progressive role in Europe. And a big step in this, one of the big steps, occurs in 1947 when the Congress passes the National Security Act. On one hand, National Security Act is really just kind of this bureaucratic act. It creates a new government bureau, the Department of Defense, the Pentagon. Prior to that time, it had been called the Department of War. So it creates the Department of Defense, the Pentagon. It creates a new group to advise the president called the NSC, the National Security Council. We know much about that because it's gained more and more importance over the last 10, 15, 20 years. Today, there's no doubt that the NSC in this current administration is far more important than the State Department. Condoleezza Rice over Colin Powell, slam dunk. So the NSC was created as a result of the National Security Act, this group of people who are supposed to advise the president. The National Security Act creates an independent Air Force. And importantly, it also creates a Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, which supersedes the old OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. The CIA is supposed to gather information on foreign enemies, although later on, if you remember, it actually conducted surveillance on Americans too, which it wasn't supposed to do. The National Security Act becomes very controversial. Critics on the left and right say it's creating a militarized culture. It's creating a garrison state. It's creating a culture and a society in which we will always be vigilant. We will have to be on guard 24 hours a day because our enemies are great, and we have to always be obsessed with security. This is going to have huge implications for America's role abroad and American society, American liberty, American democracy at home. All right, so we're going to talk more next time and pick up on the national security state.